Good morning, children. We're here at St. Gertrude's Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we are doing the obituary for one of my best friends named Ted Leugers. And so to keep it on the upbeat, I invited some of my emotional support friends to keep it lively. Over here, this is Sparky. And when Ted would come to our house, he'd say, "Why do you have a rabbit?" And we'd say, "So that you would ask us every time you come, and this rabbit will outlive all of us." And so Sparky's birthday is coming up. Sparky's going to be 12 years old. And our next friend here, he's kind of left over from Halloween. This is Captain Billy. He doesn't say much, but he's a good listener. And then we have the most important person. This is Ted's namesake. When Ted got cancer about a year ago, we got our dog. Her name is Teddy, and she's the best little critter in the whole world. So we say Ted's name at least a couple dozen times a day. And lastly, here, I'll let you down. There you go, girl. There you go. And then last of all, this is our pet dinosaur. This is Blue. Hey, Blue. Ooh. Oh. Yeah, Blue, we all miss Ted. I know what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, we're here in St. Gertrude's, and Ted always reminded me that it's a great church, but the acoustics are bad. So thanks, Ted. So if I don't speak up loud enough, it's my own fault. We have Ted's family is here. Tricia's out here to my left, and I see there's Brian and George and Sean and Shannon and Kelly. The kids are all here. Their spouses, all the grandkids are here. His brother Jerry, and there's Pam. I see Pam down there. And so, guys, what we're going to do is when you attend a funeral, you hear all these accolades about superlative. This is the best father. This is the greatest Christian person. But I'm going to give you my perspective because I've known Ted since I was 14 years old. And so I'm going to start when I was about 19 years old. I took my motorcycle over to Ted's house, and Ted said, "I can hear it." He said, "Greg, you blew a piston." And I didn't have the money to fix it. Ted says, "Well, I can fix it for you." I said, "Can you?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you know anything about motorcycle engine?" He said, "No, I'll just read it." And Ted could just read it. So over the month, he rebuilt the entire engine to my motorcycle. The important thing I want you to take from this is Ted had a broken arm. He did the whole thing with his left hand. And he did it because he was my friend. So this was about 1969, and Ted was my roommate at Xavier. And Vietnam was going on, and one night they had the draft lottery, and I was at work, and I came back and we found that in the lottery, if you got a draft number over 100, you weren't going to go into the service. If you got under 100, you were going to be drafted. And so I got to the dormitory that evening, and everybody was drunk. I've never seen so many drunk people. Either they were drowning their sorrows or they were celebrating because they weren't going to go to Vietnam. And there was Ted. And Ted was kind of a teetotaler. I've really never seen him drunk except this time. He was smashed. And he came down the hall and he says, "Nobis, you SOB, your draft number is 287, you're out." I went, "Hey, that was great." And I said, "Ted, how about you?" And he stood at attention, and he started singing this song that his brother George thought of. "I want to be an airborne ranger. I want to go to Vietnam." And then he started laughing. Well, at the time, Ted and I were both in ROTC in case we were going to have to go to the service. So I opted out, and Ted stayed in there. And but that was Ted's subtle sense of humor, singing about Vietnam. So the rest of this story in this dorm is about 3-4 weeks later. We had a big party in our room, and some of our friends from the next dormitory, they actually went through a wall. It was a drywall, and we broke it. And a couple days later, the hall director came down and reprimanded us and said, "Hey, Nobis Leugers, this is your second time, and we want to know who did this damage." And we said, "Well, we did." And they said, "No, you two guys couldn't have done all this damage." And he just made it real clear, if you don't tell us who this is, you guys are out of here. And Ted would not throw his friends under the bus. Wouldn't do it. Neither would I. And so, we paid for it, and the director came back the next day and said, it's going to be Christmas break. We expect all your stuff to be out of here when we get back to start the next semester. So we said, okay. So over the holidays, Ted and I went back to the room. We picked up all our stuff, and we found an empty room into the next dormitory. And so we moved over there with our friends, the guys that actually broke the wall. And so Ted thought this was hilarious because Ted's pretty straight, but we snuck around. We went down to the bursar's offices. Oh, by the way, we changed rooms, and nobody even knew what happened. But Ted thought this was hilarious because you guys know how straight your dad was. And then over the next 25 years were kind of a blur. I had 5 kids. Ted had 5 kids. We were busy running our family, so we had a disconnect there during that period. So we probably reconnected back in 1998. And during that time, Ted and I, for the next 20 years, we would go on these little jaunts, and it was really a lot of fun. Ted would call me, his sense of humor. I'm sure Brian and Tricia would hear him say, "Oh, Greg, you're not a man unless you buy this GTO I found for you on sale in Hamilton, Ohio." Or he'd call and say, "Hey, you won't be able to sleep at night unless you buy this Sunbeam Tiger." So he was always finding me these cars all over the place. And actually, I did buy a couple of them, but it was fun. It was, we traveled together. And so sometimes we travel, on Ted's business, he'd let me go with him. And other times we were just going out looking at cars. But during this whole time, the most important thing to Ted was his family. We talked a little bit about business, but it was his family. The phone would ring all the time. And Ted and I took Brian's truck. We're down in Alabama, and the phone sitting there, and I go, "Hey, Ted, it's your son Brian." And Ted would pick up the phone and say, "Ted Leugers." I said, "Ted, of course it's Ted Leugers. It's your phone." And he would chuckle about it. And then his daughter Shannon would call, looking for her mother. And I'd say, "Ted, it's Shannon." And he said, "Ted Leugers." He would do the same thing. He always answered it, his full name, even to his kids. And so we tease him about it. So Shannon had called, and Shannon was bringing her dog over. And at the time, Ted was babysitting for Kelly's dog. So they had 2 golden retrievers. And so we're sitting in the car, and Ted goes, he said, "Greg, do you know how much dog hair there is from 2 golden retrievers?" And I said, "Probably a little bit." And I said, "Ted, you love those dogs." He said, "Yeah, but I don't want them to know that." I go, "Why?" He says, "Because I told Tricia she's not allowed to have a dog." So he had a nice little chuckle about that. And then those were 2. And George was the best, because George and I used to both needle him. George was making a career change, and Ted had done all this research on Chase Bank, the Huntington, Commerce National Bank, Fifth Third, and they would talk. I mean, they would talk for, I wouldn't say for hours, but a half an hour at a time, talking about, different forms of banking. And Ted would read it one time, and he would remember everything. And George would call us, and we were in West Virginia, and we kept losing the cell. And Ted would answer the phone, "Ted Leugers." We'd lose the call, and he'd say, "Call me back." George would call him back, "Ted Leugers." And so, it got to be funny. So George and I would razz Ted about doing it, answering the phone all this time. But you know why he answered the phone like this? It's because it was the proper way to answer the phone. This was before caller ID. He always answered it. And he continued till the day he died, answered his phone, "Ted Leugers." In the hospital bed, when I called him, he'd say, "Ted Leugers." And rarely do I recall Ted ever saying goodbye. He would always say, "Thanks for calling." And especially in the last couple of years, I never really heard him say goodbye. It's always, "Hey, thanks for calling." The love of his life was the military. And so Sean and Kelly would talk about, they were in the service at the time, and Kelly would call from would do like the FaceTime from Germany, and Ted would just light up like a Christmas tree. And he said, "Oh, I can't talk to you. I'm driving now." But he was so excited. "Hey, when we get to our room tonight, I'm going to call Kelly back." And Sean, same thing. He loved the Marines. He would talk to Sean about the Marines, but he wanted Sean to come back to Columbus or come back to Cincinnati. And Sean was teaching in a high school in Columbus, and Ted said, we've got to get Sean. I miss him. We got to get Sean back to Cincinnati. Sure enough, Sean came back to Cincinnati and was teaching in Moeller High School, and that was it. He just loved the kids. He was so proud of his kids. I could tell you every car that every one of his kids had. And so, guys, the trail, there's a number of stories that we had when we were traveling, but the best ones were when I went with him on his business. And as you know, Ted was in security, and in fact, for those who don't know it, Ted wrote the security system for Riverfront Stadium. And I never let him down. I said, "Ted, maybe that's why they tore it down." And he'd say, "Yeah, thanks." So we were going up to the Sioux Locks. And so we were up, obviously we were on the American side, and Ted was doing something, and he had gone up about a month beforehand, and he didn't have the clearance. And so it was like, it was like 5 layers up that he had to get a security clearance to work in the Sioux Locks. And I think all he was doing, he said, "Greg, I'm probably changing a combination lock on one of their doors. It's just all this bureaucracy." But he was always, he was always upfront about it. And so we came there, and it was March, and the ice was still in the locks, and they had and so we were inside security, but there was a seawall there, and I was kind of leaning over to just to see the ice in there, and this security guard comes up and goes, "Hey, civilian, get back. We don't want any accidents." And so Ted walked over and said, "Yeah," he said, "now which country would pull him out of the water?" I mean, I lost it. I went back to the car, and Ted didn't laugh until we got back to the car, but that was Ted's sense of humor. It was hilarious. And on this particular trip, we left the Upper Peninsula, and we came down to Midland, Michigan. And we called, Ted was there to call on Dow Chemical. And for those of you who don't know Dow Chemical, it's like Fort Knox. There's a perimeter fence that goes around that's about a half mile out from their buildings. And it's the most secure facility that I think I've ever seen. In fact, I couldn't go up to the gate. In fact, no one gets in there unless you're Ted Leugers. And the thing was, I don't think Ted ever sold them anything from his companies. He just liked these guys. And they were so far ahead of everyone else in security, they would bounce things back and forth off of Ted. And we were up there, and they were busy for an appointment, but Ted said, "Hey, let's go to Bone Daddy's." And Ted knew that these guys from Dow Chemical, they loved barbecue. And Bone Daddy's I think it is probably the best barbecue I've ever had, especially in Michigan, And so we get to this restaurant, and they came in, and his two customers, or his two contacts rather, came in, and they brought their friends. And so there's about 10 of us here. And so Ted was telling him the story about how the security guard was chapping me up the Sioux Locks. Now, when Ted would tell a story, he would start laughing before you get to the end of the story. So you'd start laughing with him. And so he was telling these guys the story, and he was laughing before he got to the end. And then he told another one that they were security jokes that I probably didn't even get them, but they loved Ted. And so after they finished, everybody ordered, and they had the last person was served, and everybody waited. And Ted said, "Let's say grace." So all these guys that he didn't even know, Ted made the sign of the cross, and everyone bowed their head and said grace, because that's how he was. He wore his faith on his sleeve, not his emotions, his faith. And you didn't have a hot dog at the ballpark unless you said grace first. That's how he was. And so they finished saying grace, and I looked at the fellow next to me. I said, I said, I said, you must have half your staff there. Who's minding the store while you guys are here? And he held up his phone, and he said, no. He said, we have the cameras on. Hey, plus Ted's here for lunch. That's how much they thought of Ted Leugers. They all came over. What a great time that was. And so I hope you guys are as proud of your dad, because he was smarter than the companies that he worked for. Yeah, he was that good. And so that was his faith. Actually, I have 3 of my pride possessions that I got from Ted were 3 things actually. For my birthday last year, it's sitting in the back there. It's my Trump flag. I gave him a Trump flag for his birthday, and 2 days later he sent me one. And you could never say anything against President Trump to Ted Leugers. He loved that guy. And the other one was I had a Xavier tie. Ted and I went to our 50th Xavier College reunion. But this is the one that Ted sent to me, because he said no man should be without a flashlight. In fact, I know Kelly and I know Brian, you're sitting out here listening to how Ted would tell us the correct way to use a flashlight. And you know, your dad would never say, would never criticize. When he wanted to make a point, he would start with a question like, why are you handling that flashlight in that direction? Or doesn't that hurt your hand when you... He would go on and on, but this is the king of flashlights, Ted Leugers. And I have one other thing about concerning, you know, what Ted would do anything for other people. Well, my son had a bad experience in Chicago with a company. He came back in town, and we enlisted George Leugers to help him find a job, help my son find a job. And Ted said, well, I know the perfect solution. Boat ride on the river with lunch at Hooters. That was Ted's solution. That would bring everything back into perspective. So I thought I'd share that with you. And the last story I have was we were deadheading to, it's called the Shriners Church. It's in Detroit, Michigan. And the Shriners Church, it's actually a museum now, and it's dedicated to all the people that lost their lives on the Great Lakes. And we're getting there, and Ted said, we got to get there before noon. And so every day at noon, they would play the bells. They'd toll for 29 times for all the sailors who lost their lives on the Edmund Fitzgerald. But that's not why we were racing to get there. It was on a Thursday, and every Thursday they say mass for all of the people who had lost, of the ships that have gone down on all of the Great Lakes. And it was at noon every Thursday. Ted didn't want to be late for mass because that's how he was. You didn't wear jeans to church. You wore a collared shirt, and you would arrive 15, 20 minutes before mass starts, because Ted said you need to center yourself before you go to church. And so we'd be here at our house, and mass was at 9 o'clock. Ted would be heading out the door at 8 o'clock. We said, Ted, let Tricia sleep in here. Mass doesn't start till 9. He said, oh, you can never be too early. And that was your dad. That's how he was. And, oh, wait a minute. Oops. Just a minute. It's Ted. Okay. I'll tell him. Ted says he's got 3 things to say. All right. Shoot. Oh, he said, Tricia, he loves you very much. I said, Ted, I think they all know that. What else? Yeah, they're all here. Yeah, all your kids are there, grandkids. Yeah, Susie's sitting down here. Pam's there. Okay, I'll tell him. Ted said he's going to be gone for a little while and wants to make sure you look after Tricia while he's gone. Okay. They're nodding their heads, yeah. Ted, we're going to be late for church. What's the last thing? He said, tell Tricia she can have a dog now.
Ted, you left us way too soon. Thanks for calling.